So please join me in welcoming Marshall and Merle Goldman.
Thanks, Phil. It's good to be back. 51 years is a long time, but I see Middlebury is still here, and so are we. I guess it was more important that we're here. I'll speak first, and then Merle will speak about China, obviously. And what we're going to do is talk about the role of Russia, China, and the United States. We're often asked, what are the main powers challenging the United States? And as an economist, I've always found it's very difficult to make any kinds of predictions unless they're so 51 years in advance and then nobody remembers what you've said. But to illustrate the problem, I'll begin with a story about a balloonist, and I'll end with a story about a balloonist, and you can make your judgments based on that. So the story begins, it involves economists in both cases taking the balloon and a hot air balloon, which economists are pretty good at. So here are these two economists in the balloon. They're flying over Russia, and they get lost, which again is not uncommon. And so they see a peasant on the field, and so they lower the balloon, and they say to the peasant, "Which way is Moscow?" And the peasant says, "I don't know." "Well, then which way is Moscow?" And the peasant says, "I don't know." So the economist says, "Well, you don't know very much, do you?" And the peasant says, "No, but I'm not lost." Well, in some sense, making a prediction this way involves that kind of difficulty. Let me really go very quickly, in a small amount of time, from the Soviet Union to Russia. Stalin was determined to make the Soviet Union a superpower. He had this notion of being encircled by the United States and our allies, and to ensure that the country would develop the way he wanted it, he imposed the Iron Curtain, saying the world hates us, the world is conspiring to undo us. And this was very important for him in terms of making the people sacrifice. And so Russia, the Soviet Union at that point, restricted consumption, housing was sacrificed, people were living in communal apartments, there was a shortage of food, there was a shortage of people, massive starvation in the 30s. But there was a very high level of investment, and that really drove the economy in a very rapid way. So the result was that not only was there investment, but also because they felt they were encircled, they were spending as much as 20% of the GDP on military equipment. That was an enormous sacrifice. And investment for the future, which meant you didn't consume, and military expenditures for armaments that you didn't consume. Some people say that the military expenditures were actually more than 20%. Gorbachev says in his book it was 20%. But in some cities, for sure, we've traveled on the Trans-Siberian Road, and in Irkutsk, for example, they say that 70% of the industrial activity in the city was devoted to military production, which meant that it was not for consumption. Well, that built a strong army, that made them, in military activities, that made them a superpower. And also it meant that they were doing research, and they were doing advanced research. They set up secret cities, closed cities. They had the Academy of Sciences, they had research laboratories. And in some sense, from Stalin's point of view, the Iron Curtain was not just to keep Russians from going out, but it was to keep foreigners from coming in to learn what was going on in those laboratories, which Stalin thought after a time would really be world leaders. And remember, they were the first in space, so in some sense, he was correct. Well, what were the results? The results were that they propelled the economy. In the 1970s, and particularly the 1960s, even during a Khrushchev period, remember he came and he said he will overtake and surpass the United States, will bury you, were his words. And they reached a point where the Soviet GDP was about 50% of ours. It was distorted, but it was about 50% of ours. But it was a warped system because it was devoting all those resources to military production and to investment. And it contained the seeds of its own destruction. If the population could ever see what was happening on the outside world, they would then become unhappy. We've sacrificed enough. We've sacrificed all this time, and what do we have to show for it? And gradually, with time, as technology changed, the Iron Curtain became penetrable, and the Soviets began to see, and they began to question the sacrifices. More than that, the military potential became endangered if technology began to change rapidly. Central planning, which of course was the Soviet system, worked well if you could project 5 years into the future and move gradually towards that future. And if you knew what the technology was, and it was not much different 5 years after you began the planning process. And that was an advantage for the centrally planned system because you could force people to invest, to save, the system saved, and you could project and build these things that then you would build the biggest. It was just, it got enormous economies of scale. It was if everybody came from Texas. The bigger, the better. They prided themselves on gigantomania, and they prided themselves on machine tools. Machine tools seem to do, that's heavy industry, massive equipment, for Soviet leaders what sex does for most of us. They had a fetish about it, and the bigger the machine tools, somehow or other it was more satisfying, more gratifying for them. And so they built these massive things, and they were going to be the world's leaders. The problem is the strategy collapses if you begin ultimately to have to extract those savings not from the rural population, which had not much choice, but from the urban population. And as the Soviet Union developed, you got more and more people moving to the urban areas. And more than that, also if technology begins to change rapidly. So the advantage of the old system was you could extract the savings and you could plan on the assumption that technology did not change. But by the time we get to the later 1970s and the 1980s, technology is changing very rapidly. And the central planning system can't cope with that. It doesn't know what to do with it. They don't have words for biotechnology. They don't have words for software. They just are not able to keep up this way. So the Soviet Union collapses almost overnight, and a very steep decline. I don't have GDP figures here, but I can just show you, because I'm going to refer to it later, to oil production. So if you take, say the high point here, 1980, Russia was producing 547 million tons of oil a year. That's just short of 11 million barrels a day. Now look what happens. By 1996, it falls to 301. So it's not quite half, but it's certainly an enormous decline. And the GDP, the industrial production, the same thing was happening there. Now Gorbachev, who comes into power in 1985, begins to sense that this old system that had seemingly worked so well was now becoming obsolete and was going to crash. And he understood, particularly, that as technology began to change rapidly and the Soviets could not keep up, that they couldn't keep up, particularly when you got a president like Ronald Reagan, who was determined to not negotiate with the Russians until he felt that he was an equal militarily and politically. And so Reagan decided he was going to turn the United States into a military factory. And indeed, we began to spend very large sums on military activity too, installing missiles in Europe, which would challenge and counter the Soviets, which up until that point, actually, some say, had a greater missile capability than we did. To some extent, I also have to say, some people say I give too much credit to Reagan, but he was important. But in part, it was, I think, his success was due to the fact that he was hard of hearing. And I'll illustrate this with my father-in-law. When my father-in-law came to this country, he was penniless. All he had was a ticket to the one relative he had in this country, which was in St. Louis. He got off at Ellis Island. The next morning, he gets on a train heading to St. Louis. And he finds himself in a car with row with an Orthodox Jew. And that morning, the Orthodox Jew starts saying his morning prayers, and my father-in-law, to accompany him, starts saying the prayers as well. All of a sudden, the train comes to an abrupt halt, and he falls and cuts his head, and he starts bleeding. The conductor comes by to see if everybody in the train is okay. But they were at that point in the morning prayers where you can't talk. So the conductor came by and said, "Is everybody okay?" He said, "Oh, I see you're bleeding. Let me give you $50 to take care of your medical expenses." My father-in-law couldn't say anything. $75. So by the time he gets to St. Louis, his cousin can't understand how you can arrive in America penniless but end up with $300 just on that train trip. Gorbachev and Reagan meet, and we were lucky to be in Geneva, not in the room, obviously, but in Geneva when they first met. And Gorbachev, sensing these problems that I talked to you about, said, "I've got to stop this military race, and I've got to stop, if I could just get Reagan to stop, will you stop the military race?" Reagan says, "What'd you say?" So Gorbachev says, "Okay, I'll do away with my missiles." Reagan said, "What'd you say?" "Okay, I'll do away with my tanks." And ultimately, the Cold War comes to an end, largely because Reagan can't hear what Gorbachev is proposing. And so the Soviet Union, instead of being this massive superpower, suddenly unwinds. And the best analogy I can think of is when I was a kid, I would sometimes go to a carnival, and the Daredevil Act would be a wooden cylinder where they would have motorcyclists build up enough speed so that they could defy death, they could defy gravity, they would be perpendicular to the wall, parallel to the ground. And the whole trick, of course, was to have them slow down so they would crash. But the idea, if they didn't, then you know, that was it. But if they slowed their momentum, they would crash. In that Soviet Union, when they were spending money on military activities, that sustained the economy. It propelled them. It gave them the drive. But when Gorbachev began to negotiate with Reagan and began to cut military expenditures, then the momentum slowed down, and the Soviet industry didn't know what to do with what they were producing. One of my communist friends said, I never again want to hear how much steel we're producing because it doesn't do me any good. And when the Cold War came to an end, the Soviets were producing about 3 million tons of aluminum, but they were not building airplanes anymore, and so they could only use about 200, 300 tons of it. The rest of it, they began actually to dump on world markets. And so today, the Russian economy is about 1/10 of ours, from about 50% during the Cold War to 1/10. Again, measured very differently, but that's the size of the chain. Okay, well, where does Putin come in on all this? Putin realizes that Russia is militarily weak. And so he starts out at least with a very limited political agenda. And he's trying to focus as much as he can on the economy in the hopes that he can build it up. And his goal, as he stated, is to double the GDP in 10 years, which means you have to have 7% growth compounded, which will give you a doubling. But where is the growth coming from? Well, now look what's happened here after 1996, but more importantly after 1998. You see that just like the GDP, oil production begins to grow, so that last year they had a growth of 470 million tons, not quite up to where they were, where Russia was before. The collapse began, but still pretty far along. And oil and gas, when you're paying $70 or $75 a barrel, is a nice thing to have. Now, he's hoping he can restructure. But the trouble is, just like so many other oil economies, oil is a drug, and you become stuck with it, and it's very difficult under those circumstances to build up the rest of your economy, your manufacturing sector, because there's such a great demand for Russian oil. Russia is alternates with Saudi Arabia as the world's largest producer of petroleum. In January, it produced more than Saudi Arabia did. Normally it's second, but it's the second largest, overall the second largest, and sometimes I say challenging Saudi Arabia. It's also the world's second largest exporter of petroleum. And that gives an enormous windfall. But it means then that what you're doing is you're just producing petroleum and not much else. And the money comes running in. That means everybody wants the ruble so they can buy the petroleum, which pushes up the value of the ruble, which makes the ruble very expensive. Which means then that Russians who are paid in rubles can find it easy to buy goods in dollars, which are cheap. So it's easier to buy dollars and even goods in dollars and even goods that are sold in euros, which hurts domestic manufacturing in Russia. By the same token, the goods that are produced in Russia become too expensive to export on the outside, so it hurts the manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing sector is not in such good shape. And he's trying to build it up, but it just doesn't happen. Now, what you see here is just the structure of exports. The years are at least comparable. Look, in the case of China, Merle will talk more about that. Manufactured goods amount to about 90% of what's exported. Last time you were in a Walmart, did you ever try to find something made in the United States? Well, that's part of the reflection. But look at the case of Russia, and this is 2003, before oil prices skyrocket. Over half of Russian exports are energy related. So this is a very significant. Okay, so now let me come to the question: where does Russia stand relative to the United States, to China, to other countries? This is, you can do this yourself. It's an attempt to just put down on a piece of paper how things change, how we stand to each other. On the horizontal axis, I've just put political strategic aspirations. What are your political ambitions? On the vertical axis, your economic and your military capabilities. The easiest way to understand this is to take a country like Japan, which has very limited political aspirations, although now they want to join the Security Council. But for the most part, they're not high on this horizontal axis. But they have enormous economic capabilities, particularly now that their economy seems to be recovering. For the United States, until recently, I don't want to say until our present administration, so I won't say that, but you know, we had a strong economic capability, and we had certainly we have important political strategic aspirations. But what's been happening to our economy as it's hollowed out, you know, we may be lowering our capabilities in the future. What we're doing now is certainly going to impinge on the future. So where we were in 2000, where we will be in the future, I don't know. Russia, the Soviet Union, as it were, when the economy collapsed, was at a low level economically, but now it's beginning to grow, and so the year 2010, it's at least here, and I'll have something more to say about that in a second. China had no economic capabilities, but it always had strong political aspirations, so it was low economically, but high politically. But now, China, where it's going in the new world that Merle will talk about, you can see that it's growing economically, and it's certainly going to be much stronger politically as that begins to happen. So Putin now is looking at this, and I would argue that within the last year, actually, he's even beginning to become much more assertive. I think he's come to recognize something that is only just dawning on us in the United States and even the West Europeans. What's happening is that Russia has become the Saudi Arabia of the North, with attitude. And that's a reflection of what took place this past January. He says, you know, he just gave a press conference on January 31st, and he was asked what, you know, Senator McCain and Congressman Lantos have said, we should not let you into the G8, the largest seven largest economically democratic countries in the world. Russia has been invited. Putin is the chairman of the group this year. They will meet in St. Petersburg in July, and people are saying it's not democratic, it's doing the wrong thing. It cut off the gas to Ukraine, which in turn cut it off, the flow that was supposed to go to Western Europe. But with that gas and oil, he can do more or less as he pleases. And what is important, what is just dawning on us, is with that oil and gas, just very quickly, you can see where, again, the size of Russian exports, which rose from below 100 billion to now 2005, because of the oil and gas, over 245, imports 125 billion. That means they're running a trade surplus, an annual trade surplus of $120 billion a year. You know, ours is, of course, a deficit. And what that also means is that more and more countries are becoming very, very heavily dependent on Russia. So look at Germany. Germany gets 40 to 41% of the imports of its natural gas from Russia. When that gas pipeline was cut off, they noticed it, particularly since it was January. Look at Italy. Look at, well, Turkey, of course, is much closer, but France, 30%. And with a gas pipeline, you don't have many options because the gas pipeline is very expensive. You can't build a standby gas pipeline just to let it sit there. So, and of course, Eastern Europe, 100%. And what's also intriguing is that even petroleum, where you can substitute more, where it's more fungible, Germany now gets 42%, about the same percentage of its petroleum from Russia. They've got them where it hurts, and they can squeeze them this way. This is a new form of power that is unprecedented in Soviet life. So going back to that diagram that we have here, it may be that Russia's economic potential is not so great, but boy, oh boy, its external political power is very strong. At a press conference, January 31st this year, Putin was asked about McCain, Senator McCain and Congressman Lantos, and he said, the dog barks, but the caravan moves on. Turns out it's very appropriate. It's an old saying from Saudi Arabia. The dog barks, let him bark. We ignore them. We move on. We've got the gas and oil. They don't like it. They're going to have to come to us. And if they don't want our terms, we'll send it to China. Okay, well, let me conclude. Is this diagram useful or meaningful? Well, I go back to my story about the balloonists. Two different balloonists now. They're also lost. And they see a man in the field, a peasant in the field. They lower the balloon. Where are we? And the man says, in a balloon. So one guy says to the other in the balloon, that guy was an economist. He says, how do you know? He says, well, his answers were factually correct, but absolutely useless. That's it.
The Russians have all the jokes. The Chinese don't have jokes, but we have other things, as you will hear. And as you will hear, you will see that I'm an historian, and not quite. I cannot relate exactly to Marshall's economic story, but I will treat this more in terms of history. China, as many of you know, was a great power up until the 19th century, and it was devastated by the Western impact. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the poorest, most isolated country in the world. At the time of Mao's death in 1976, China was still the poorest, most isolated country in the world. Yet at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, what's happening? It is the most dynamic economy in the world, growing at 9 to 10% a year. For the last 25 years, the World Bank says this is not only the fastest rate of growth of any country in the world today, it's the fastest rate of growth of any country in world history. So, let the economists deal with that. But the question is, how did this happen? How did we have this sudden transformation? And as I see it, there are many reasons, but we can go back to the revolution in 1949. The official evaluation of Mao Zedong is, this is a Chinese communist evaluation, is that he's 70% good and 30% bad. When I taught my class, I turned that around, and I said he was 70% bad and 30% good. But the 30% good is very important in understanding what's happening today. First of all, he had the strategy to unite China after almost 100 years of disunion. Secondly, he provided education to the younger generation so that China today, remember this is a country of 1,300,000,000 people, has a literacy rate of close to 90%. That's another great achievement. Thirdly, he raised the position of women. And fourthly, he provided, China was a very poor country, yet it had a life expectancy of that of a developed country during his time in office. And what was it? This idea of the barefoot doctors, everybody laughed at it, but a basic health care was provided. These were barefoot doctors, barely trained, but trained enough to go from village to village. They would come into a village, they clean up the water, they provide sanitation, they would give injections for various diseases, and they move on. But these basic health care methods were to lead to a healthy population. So that when Mao dies in 1976, he has a large, relatively literate population, a healthy population, and it's on this basis that his successor, Deng Xiaoping, begins China's economic reforms. Now, China's economic reforms, unlike those in the Soviet Union really took off. And the reasons they took off, I believe, and I'm an historian, so I believe it comes from their history. First of all, even though Marx said China was a feudal society, it was not a feudal society. China was a society of small land-holding farmers. These were farmers who planted their crops and then took their crops to market to sell their crops, so they had to be entrepreneurial. Their wives were stayed at home, but their wives would do weaving. They would cultivate silk or silkworms, and they also got involved in supporting the family. So that when Deng Xiaoping came to power after Mao's death in October 1976, and he unleashed the economy, they went to a market economy almost immediately. You had millions and millions of small entrepreneurs that took advantage of that. Now, Marshall didn't he's written a whole book about the oligarchs. But in the in Russia, or the post-Soviet period, what happened is you had a small number of oligarchs who really took over the resources, but you had very few small entrepreneurs. The major difference in China is that these entrepreneurs just literally came out of the woodwork and started dealing in anything they could find, and husbands and wives as well. One of our colleagues did a study of this district around Beijing University. It's called Haidian area, which has all kinds of software companies. And in his study, he found that 2/3 of those companies were owned by women. And so it's not just that the males in the society, the women are also involved in this entrepreneurial system. Moreover, when Mao launched his Great Leap Forward, which was one of the reasons why I said it's 77% bad, because it led to the death of over 30 million Chinese peasants. But nonetheless, he decreed that every peasant commune was to set up its own small-scale industry. So that when China went to the market in the rural areas, they had these small-scale industries that then were at first collective and then were taken over by small entrepreneurs. But nonetheless, they did have industry coming down to the countryside. Moreover, whereas China had about 30 years or 25 years, 30 years of communism, the former Soviet Union had 70 years. So that when Mao dies, there are still people there who know how to wheel and deal. They know how to go to the market. They know how to make a living out of very little. And so these are the people that really responded very, very quickly right after Mao's death. Now, another big difference was that, unlike in the former Soviet Union, there was very little resistance within the Chinese Communist Party. Why was that? Because Mao, and again, this is another reason why I say he's 70% bad, Mao in 1966 believed that the party was conspiring against him. His Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 66 to 76, was turned against his own party. He mobilized the Red Guards to go out and rebel against the party, so that when Deng Xiaoping comes to power, the party is decimated. There's no one there to oppose him. When he says, I want to go to the market, they said, okay, because the party had lost its legitimacy. And Deng said the only way we can regain our legitimacy is through delivering economically. And so it gave the party the ability to remain in power, was because they delivered economically. And in the former Soviet Union, they couldn't do that. Gorbachev couldn't do that. The people who preceded him couldn't do that. And that is one of the reasons, I believe, why you still have the Chinese Communist Party in power. Another reason is that, unlike Mao, who was ideological and tried to impose a kind of ideal state onto China, Deng Xiaoping and his followers were very pragmatic. Their philosophy, well, there wasn't a philosophy. Their idea was you cross the river to the other side for feeling for the stones as you go across. In other words, you see what works. If it works, you go with it. If it doesn't, you get rid of it. So what happens after Mao dies? Peasants in some of the poorest provinces began to take their land out of the commune and farm it as a family farm. And when Deng's colleagues in the provinces reported to him that the peasants were doubling their income and then doubling it again, Deng said, okay, let the whole country go back to family farming. So initially, the benefactors of the reforms were the peasants. They took back their land, they began to produce for the market, and in the 1980s, they were the major benefactors of these reforms. So it began in agriculture. And it's very interesting, if you look at the post-Confucian countries, as we call them, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, again, their economic beginnings, or their economic dynamism began in agriculture with land reform. Land reform, by the way, is traditional in China. Every new dynasty that came to power had land reform in order to get rid of feudalism. So land reform really does work in this context. And so the country took off, beginning in the countryside. And then, of course, this reforms then began to move to the city. And when it began to move to the city, China became open to the outside world, inviting people in for joint enterprises. The Soviets and the Russians did not do that. And China would have go with the major American enterprises, major European enterprises on a 50-50 basis. And so foreign capital came in. Another thing that China had that Russia didn't have were the overseas Chinese. These were Chinese who were poor. They lived along the coast of China. And in the 19th century, or even earlier, they began moving to the rest of Asia and then to Africa and even to the United States, and became the small business people in these communities. For example, in Indonesia, they could not buy land. They settled in the cities. They became the entrepreneurs. They became the professionals. The economists once did a study of the overseas Chinese. They said we cannot even estimate their wealth. Initially, when Mao came to power, they came and offered to help China. Mao rejected them. When Deng came to power, they again came and said, we want to help our country, our homeland. Deng says, come back. And they came back. And they came back and they invested their capital. They invested their management skills. They invested their entrepreneurial savvy. And when I'm talking about overseas Chinese, I'm talking also about the people in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Today, over 1 million Taiwanese are living in Shanghai, involved in enterprises in China. So they have been a dynamic factor in this tremendous growth that we see in China. So, where does that get us? We've had economic reform, but there has not had political reform. And this is the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, is still very much in control of China today. And you can ask, how can you have this dynamic economic reform and transform your social structure with a large new entrepreneurial class and still not have political reform? And one of the reasons they've been able to have this way, we associate the development of a middle class, an entrepreneurial class, a bourgeoisie, with the beginnings of political reform in the West. But that is not what is happening here in China. And one of the reasons for this, and this is, again, you can see this is very savvy what they're doing. The new entrepreneurs are being inducted into the Chinese Communist Party. They are being co-opted. It's the same way in traditional Chinese history. The most educated, the literati, were co-opted into the political structure so they wouldn't undermine it, so they would help it. Well, that is exactly what's happening here. However, so the entrepreneurs, especially the big entrepreneurs, are becoming the major sector of new party members. But there are other members of the middle class, the intellectuals, the journalists. I write about them in my book, From Comrade to Citizen. The ex-Red Guards who had been mobilized to rebel against the party. They caused chaos. Mao sent them out to the countryside. They were terribly disillusioned. They saw there had not been a real revolution in the countryside. They came back to the cities. They had to make a living. They became the small entrepreneurs. They questioned the system. So it's this kind of small entrepreneurs are the ones that are questioning the system. Nonetheless, the party, because it has been able to deliver economically, has had its legitimacy. It is not really questioned at this point. But there's something else going on in China today, which is not happening in Russia, or not in the former Soviet Union, or not even in Eastern Europe. And this is, they are now beginning to have large-scale protests. In the year 2004, there were 47,000 protests. In the year 2005, there were 87,000 protests. That's a great increase, and they are growing. Why are they growing? What's happening here? And this you do not see in Russia, or certainly in Eastern Europe either. What is happening? That as these reforms took off, they led to increasing inequalities between the coastal areas here that were involved in international trade and the inner provinces, and particularly between the rural sector and the urban sector. The rural sector took over in the 80s. By the 1990s, they are falling behind, and the urban sector is taking off. Now, the reforms in China, unlike Russia, that initially benefited everybody. China's poverty level was reduced from 40% to below 5%. That's an extraordinary change. However, the rural sectors now feel they're being exploited. What is happening? The cities are expanding. You go to a city in China, you go down the Yangtze River, and they say we are approaching a middle-sized city of Wuhan. Wuhan, this is a city of 8 million people. That's middle-sized. And you come there, and it's booming, and it's building infrastructure everywhere. And so the cities are really taking off, and the farmers are losing their land to these big cities, and they're not being compensated, or not being compensated enough. They are protesting. That's one area in which they're protesting. Workers who work for state industry, that has now been being privatized. They're not getting their pensions or their health care that they have relied on. They are beginning to protest. The environmental pollution, the air, the water, is terribly polluted because of this massive drive of industrialization. So there are protests against that. There are all kinds of regulations in China, but the local officials are being bought off by the entrepreneurs, and so that the rural area in particular feels that it's being exploited, and they are terribly upset about this corruption. The present government today in China is the fourth generation of communist leaders. The first was Mao, the second was Deng, the third was the former mayor of Shanghai, Jiang Zemin, who obviously emphasized the cities. This group, led by Hu Jintao, the man who just came for a visit to the United States, they're well educated. They were educated mostly at what we call China's MIT, Tsinghua University. But they had been posted as officials in very poor provinces. Their major concern now is with the rural sector, and they're right, because this is their big problem. And they are trying to provide health care in that sector, which the peasants lost. They're trying to provide education, because that also was being undermined. And they're really giving their attention to the sector. But at the same time, this group of leaders has been more repressive in terms of dissent, in terms of cracking down on the internet, in terms of jailing journalists who expose these problems. So on the one hand, they're dealing with the problem. On the other hand, they are literally restricting the area for political discourse. In post-Mao China, there's much more freedom of speech. You can say almost anything you want within a group. You cannot say it in a public arena, and you cannot organize politically. The minute you begin to organize politically, to do anything about it, they will crack down. So I leave you with this, that China is at a crossroads. And I compare China to Russia. If you go, for example, to St. Petersburg and Moscow today, those are world-class cities. They are absolutely beautiful today. Instead of just plowing under the old structures as they did in China and building modern ones, what they did in Moscow and St. Petersburg is redo the old structures. So you get a sense of the history, and these are truly beautiful cities. China is all new cities. But you go outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg and go to the provincial villages, certainly into the cities and towns, and very little's going on. The only new buildings you see are those of the Russian Orthodox Church, which have been rebuilt. In China, you can go to the most remote area, the poorest area, and they are building what we call infrastructure. They're building roads, they're building sewers, they're building schools, they're building bridges everywhere. And that is what I see as the major difference here, that there's economic dynamism is literally taken off in China. I think what will undermine it is that this leadership has no sense of how to deal with the inequalities that were produced by these reforms, and they are faced with growing protests. One of my colleagues, Martin White, who's a sociologist, did a study of Warsaw and the people in Warsaw and Beijing. He found there were greater dissatisfaction in Warsaw with the government than in Beijing, but there are no protests in Poland, and there are massive protests all over China. What's the difference? In Warsaw, that's a democratic government. They have a free press, they have a multi-party system, they have freedom of association. There is a way in which they can channel their discontents. In China today, there is no way to channel their discontents. So even though the party has been able to thrive because of it's been able to deliver economically, I believe that in the next couple of years, we're going to see very major problems in China unless it also begins to move towards some kind of political reform. Thank you.